Hi there. Hello, LeadDev, and good afternoon. My name is Mica Alaniz. My pronouns are she, her, and we just got to get some basic facts out of the way. The first thing you need to know about me is that I am a born and raised and never leave kind of from Chicago. And that all being said, I've loved every time I've ever come to New York, and I am so happy to be here today. What's probably a bit more relevant as to why we're all here, at least in terms of facts about me, is that I'm a senior engineering manager at Slack. I know this means I have a lot in common with so many of you in this room, and I'm a member of a peer group of engineering leaders at Slack that is comprised of nearly 180 people across the world. But there's something I know I don't have in common with a lot of folks in this room, and that is having this role as an engineering manager, and before that as an engineer, at the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. The DNC is the highest level organization of the American Democratic Party and serves Democratic candidates across the country. Folks who are familiar with the organization know that its primary focus is on nominating and supporting the presidential ticket. So the reason I know that my position at the DNC is uncommon is because I work directly with a majority of the folks who were on the, at that point, nascent and heavily invested in technology team during the 4 years I was there, starting in 2017. The tech team, only part of which was the engineering team, was just so incredibly small in comparison to the goals we ended up contributing to and accomplishing during the 2018 midterm and the 2020 presidential elections. We'll come back to the size of the team as a particular data point in not too long, so keep that in mind. In fact, the last time I was even in New York was January of 2022. I took some time off between my two roles, which everyone should do if you're able, to reflect and also visit my friends and colleagues that I was moving on from on the East Coast. Shout out to the Acela, by the way, which is a great way to get between DC and New York if you haven't done it. It's a train service. This means I started at Slack in early 2022, which just feels like so long ago. I mean, I want everyone to take a second to think about where they were and what they were doing around this time. Most importantly, what did your organizations look like back then? Q1 of 2022, maybe even Q4 of 2021. What were you planning for? What were you betting on? What maybe did you take for granted at the time, at the beginning of the year, that you might not have, had you known how the rest of the year or the next 2 years were going to go? If you weren't in your current role or at your current company, maybe you can remember to ask a colleague who was these questions. My guess is that organizations, teams, hiring, and growth looked a lot like it did at Slack at the time. That on average, compared to now, your organizations were larger and your teams were larger. Resourcing was aplenty, mostly. Nothing's ever normal, but things were typical. Growth was the watchword of the day, of all the days preceding and our expectations moving forward. And I won't lie, I had the exact same expectations of growth, growing my team, aiming at loftier and bigger goals. And while there are never enough folks to get the work done that you need to, overall resourcing was less strapped, missions more clear, and there was a reliable cadence to planning and recruiting and everything that entails. At least that's how I remember it. I began at Slack and still am a member of the enterprise pillar, the name we use for departments within PDE, product, design, and engineering. To answer the questions I asked you all just now, when I joined in 2022, Enterprise had nearly 100 people, split into about 8 product teams, give or take. Each product team, including the one I was managing, were, for the most part, comprised of a split of both front-end and back-end engineers. Together with an engineering manager and a product manager, each team had a dedicated product surface to advance and build expertise in. And each team managed those features' requisite support and further development, largely scoped to within the sphere of ownership that they had. So I sat here, managing a team that I was to understand, typical for Slack. And let's be clear, this next part's a bit reductive, but follow me here. The guidance then was when a team needed more folks to meet business goals, had a heavy enough maintenance burden, or specific expertise in short supply, a case could be made to add to the team, to grow it. It was not a given, but part of my job, our jobs, all of us who line manage, is to recognize that need in our teams well in advance and make those cases. Alternatively, if there was any attrition, if you lost anyone on your team, you'd be able to backfill that role at the very least, to hire someone into the position that was vacated. At this point, I think you can understand the picture that I'm painting. Things were different, very different. In fact, let's call this time what it was, halcyon days, where we didn't know how good we had it. At Slack, there were teams whose headcount, mission, and ownership had stayed relatively consistent for a reasonable length of time, reasonable enough to make predictions, build expectations, reasonable enough to make it seem typical, even normal. That's what it seemed like to me, a relatively new member of engineering leadership who was already agog at the fact that the enterprise pillar was more than twice as large as the entire tech team that I had just moved on from at the DNC. The first inklings that something might not be quite as expected were hiring freezes. These aren't atypical, nor concerning necessarily on their own, but they did seem to last a long while. It meant with an expected rate of attrition, teams weren't able to return to the size that they once were. And then layoffs landed in early 2023. While none of those of us who remained would ever claim to be more impacted than those who were laid off, once we were able to regroup, nearly every team had been affected. The size of the enterprise pillar had been much reduced, and beyond that, there wasn't a good understanding of how long we were going to be working with this reduced staffing. But before we got too far ahead of ourselves on speculating too much about the future, we had to take stock of what was presently right in front of us. Oddly enough, this situation kept reminding me of something, kept pinging my memory of circumstances that I had dealt with in the past. The run-up to an election is chaotic in any political organization, any election, even a midterm election, no matter where you sit or what you do. And what I was hired to do in late 2017 was be a part of a team that was modernizing various uninvested in web apps across the organization, primarily working in front end, JavaScript, TypeScript, and React. However, once the summer of 2018 rolled around and that chaos had really set in, incoming support needs were growing greater than our ability to balance any priorities against them. And we had quite a few things that we wanted the space and attention to prepare for. So we created a tiny team with a shared services model, which I was on. This team was a central clearinghouse for technical expertise and data support, rather than having those individual requests go to individual teams. We would tackle the most important priority if we knew enough to determine that, and otherwise set up problems and knock them down, first in, first out. We worked in lockstep with folks who talked directly to stakeholders in Democratic state parties, sister committees like the DCCC, and data mobilization and field staff from campaigns on the ballot across the country. Working in this model gave me a rare opportunity to build context around very nearly every system that needed assistance or was any amount critical to these stakeholders. These stakeholders who were looking to the DNC for hands-on keyboard resources, technical guidance, or just to help troubleshoot data, most of which was related to voting locations across the country. A lot of this work was categorically outside the purview that I had previously been in, with my focus on existing web apps. The data sources, and most importantly, the problems with these data sources, were critical to field operations and voter protection efforts, and they became our day in, day out during those last 100 days, leading up to Tuesday, November 6th, 2018. It was my very first taste of the rare air that only an impeccable clarity of vision can give you. Every individual is tasked with taking their autonomy and their energy to achieve an incredibly singular, unified goal alongside everyone else in the room with you. And that goal is to win. When the 2018 election passed, I was incredibly grateful to have been on that little firefighting brigade, because that context I gathered was going to be put to use immediately. When I mentioned before that we had competing priorities to prepare for, what we were preparing for was this. We knew that going into 2019, that off-cycle, odd-numbered years, present a unique opportunity that cannot be squandered to do the kind of deep work of improvements and reinvestments needed to move our technology forward. As you can imagine, much of the way an organization like the DNC operates is around a boom-bust cycle. This means we needed our technology to work optimally in that exact same cadence. Our infrastructure needs to scale, and performance needs to sustain during the boom times. Essentially, we needed our path and our technical strategy to be as clear and low risk as possible to be able to support the chaos, usage, and explosive growth in the immediate run-up to an election. However, once we were done driving our data, infra, and applications at top speed down a highway toward an election, we could put everything up on blocks afterward. We had limited time to make decisions around replacing and rebuilding, and then get down to the actual work of replacing and rebuilding. The team at this point had also shrunk down even further, was very nearly as small as it had ever been since the tech team's founding. Team size, much like everything else, is also on that very same boom-bust cycle. But that singular focus, that looming deadline rallied everyone, regardless of what we had been doing. Now, as I've mentioned, I had been, up to this point, primarily positioned as a product engineer, front-end working in web apps. But the most important enormous undertaking, that preparation we were able to preserve some attention for before the election, was to completely reimagine the Democratic Data Warehouse and data platform and migrate everything we had into it fast enough to begin to catch the earlier and earlier primary races. Which meant it didn't matter what I was doing, what any of us were doing before then. It didn't matter what we were hired to do, our expertises, or even necessarily our facility with a specific language, stack, or technology. If you had a pulse and were willing to learn, specifically Python, SQL, Airflow, and Terraform, then the most impactful thing you could contribute to was the effort to migrate a lamentably flaky definition of legacy data warehouse into Google BigQuery. If you had a pulse and could teach Python, SQL, Airflow, or Terraform, then your job was to do that. Because overall, we had far too few folks to tackle the job in front of us, which was rebuilding the tech and data infrastructure that would eventually power the primary campaigns for many of the Democratic candidates vying to become the eventual presidential nominee. And if folks don't remember, that ended up being quite a good number of campaigns to onboard. Not only that, but candidates up and down the ballot running in the 2020 election besides the presidential race, which means House, Senate, and state level races, also depend on the DNC for this data. To put a finer point on it, we didn't have enough data engineers. And so all the engineers and a fair number of the data analysts became, in their own way, in whatever way they needed to get there, and with the support of their colleagues, data and analytics engineers, working together as a unified team on a single priority. That necessity demanded we encourage fluid team structures, gave us a wide open opportunity to learn and to contribute. We tossed off any preconceived notions like job title, past experience, really anything that might impede the only way that we could envision we were going to get this massive undertaking far enough along to be ready in time for the 2020 presidential election. And with that concrete example of what can be accomplished by an entire tech team from the CTO down of no more than 40 people, I began to take in the gaps and needs of the now reduced size of the enterprise pillar at Slack. While we reset expectations and roadmaps and overall tried to get the locomotive of our pillar on track as best we could, it quickly became clear that we were going to need to get creative to deliver our highest priority projects in any fashion, let alone within a time frame where they would be the most effective. There were many problems to solve for, but the main one I set my sights on was that an already dwindling group of engineers of a single discipline were even fewer. In this case, it was front-end engineers. Their capacity was a hard dependency on shipping very nearly any of those high priorities in the coming months, or the coming quarters, or, well, to be honest and to repeat, I didn't know how long we were going to be working within these limitations. No one did. But what I did know is there were two gaps to be addressed in the immediate term. The first was teams who were now without front-end engineers, These teams also happened to have some of those highest priority projects and were now without the engineers needed to deliver them. The second was that these engineers were now scattered past the point where they had enough support to feel or be effective. Originally, there'd be at least 3 or 4 of each discipline, front-end and back-end, on each team. But the way things had landed now, these engineers weren't being served in the existing vestigial organizational model, which was built around larger teams. Organic attrition and then layoffs meant that what we were left with was a team of only 1 front-end engineer. Other teams where there were 2, but they each felt like they couldn't take time off without leaving the other in a lurch. Another team had a good amount of people at 4, but these folks were concerned, especially in light of the layoffs, they could be contributing more visibly and more valuably to business and organizational goals in the coming quarters. Taking this all into account, and lining it up with my experiences moving nimbly past predefined roles and teams, I put together a proposal for an experiment. Now, I am an ardent believer in Kydland's Law, and I cannot recommend writing things out like this enough, even if it's just for you. I try to never miss an opportunity to write something, which I'm sure means my liberal arts degree is showing. The proposal I put together was to create a shared services team that combined all the front-end engineers in the enterprise pillar together. The idea was then that instead of working against the roadmap set out by the 4 individual teams that they had all been embedded on, the single unified team would work against a more relatively unified roadmap that was collected together from those existing team roadmaps. The overall pillar roadmap would be reprioritized on a regular basis, each project being weighed against all the priorities that the pillar wanted to deliver, regardless of which team that project originated with. From here, we either moved the group together in a swarm model for large programs that needed all the engineers, but more often we sent out smaller fractions of the team, 2 or 3 engineers, to pick up context and work alongside the originating team as full embedded members. This working model also meant that we addressed gaps and concerns that the engineers had. We wanted folks to have enough of that support that they were missing before to work effectively. It's just a little bit important that engineers know exactly where to go for code reviews, to ask for feedback on tech specs, and to request any other assistance they might need, whatever it might be. As an example, when these smaller groups of 2 to 3 engineers were working in parallel with each other on different features, we made sure to always come back to the whole team. We did that in order to share progress, provide context, and request support. I even put regular demos on the calendar to further facilitate that knowledge sharing. Concretely, it meant folks could do completely bananas things like take time off, and they knew another member of the team could fill in because that person had enough context in what they were working on to keep their momentum going. In order to solve for one of our original concerns, teams without front-end engineers, there is the problem of what to do when those teams needed that specific subject matter expertise to help them debug and remediate issues, escalations, and incidents. We knew it wasn't an option to have that on-call engineer turn around and have no one embedded on that team to assist. Once the experiment was in motion, having all the front-end engineers in one team together allowed us to set up an on-call rotation with a little bit of a twist. Instead of the team owning specific features and components such that they would be pinged directly during incidents, the idea was that they could get pulled into escalations and incidents by any other enterprise team once it was determined that their expertise would be at all helpful in remediation. This was another way that we scaled the expertise of just a few engineers across the entire organization. Just within those first 2 quarters, we successfully shipped several projects and milestones that not too long prior had hit a standstill in terms of staffing. We had proved that upending the notion that engineers must be embedded in their product teams, that resetting that expectation could work in addressing those places where the teams and the individuals both needed more support, if at least temporarily. Keep in mind that at heart, this was always meant to be an experiment, and my original proposal made sure that it said so right at the top. But that framing gave us the ability to freely shift what this group of engineers meant and what they needed in order to match what the organization needed. We ended up continuing the experiment through the next 2 quarters. over the course of that entire year, a year where there continued to be staffing shortages, when what we needed was all hands on deck, the team contributed to 22 completed projects within this new operational model. I often thought back to something one of the longer tenured engineers on the team had mentioned to me once, that at its largest, enterprise, with all of its teams and roadmaps, had supported as many as 17 front-end engineers. Within this new team model, we were able to scale responsibly and with intention about half that number into making a sizable, comparable enough impact across the exact same product surface. Maybe even more importantly, everyone in the pillar got familiar with this idea. The idea that we could break down team structures in order to make them more resilient and allow us all together to meet the challenges of our reduced staffing. This idea, which came from being on a team that didn't have as many staffers as there were states in the union, but feeling an outsized sense of mission and camaraderie to reconsider absolutely any possibility to get done what we needed to get done with as many people as we had, regardless of how many that was. There was this sense during my time at the DNC that is unique to very mission-driven organizations that I wish I could impart on all of you. The sense of, this is what we're facing, and there's not much use in wishing otherwise, not when the clock is ticking and the work is this important. That sense is a really helpful basis for unlocking possibilities and driving a brainstorm that maybe you and your organizations needed or still yet need. Within these limitations, this new normal, myself and the other enterprise leads at Slack were forced to ruthlessly prioritize, to realize our constraints plainly, and to trade off more aggressively. We couldn't only consider the product surface, the technical context, the sphere of what our teams owned, and needed to shift to emphasize collaborating within our wider organization to help engineers on other teams in order to operate and execute together. It became less about what my team's roadmap was, what my team has expertise in, what my team can show for their work, and more about empowering all of the engineers across our org to do something I know we do extremely well: learn and learn fast. At the beginning of this year, further organizational changes, both attrition and some additions, meant that the experiment of the front-end team could close out, but not without those important lessons and this new framework for what resilience could look like permeating into our culture. We took a look at some really big bets we wanted to accomplish, and yet again, each smaller individual team just didn't have enough folks to hit our goals for the first half of 2024, or enough of the necessary expertise for these programs to even get off the ground. We began to swarm whole teams, not just a single discipline like front-end engineers, but PMs, back-end engineers, and EMs into work streams within these larger programs to deliver milestones in parallel and to great success. And this is despite the fact that most of the engineers in the swarm were working in areas of the product and the code base that they were not at all familiar with. We've had 2 major launches using this flexible swarm model and are presently working on more in the coming months. Currently, we're on our 3rd pillar swarm. As leaders, we've shifted the way we think about how to organize and now consider as a first order of business whether Team A and Team B can join here to work on Team C's priority. In planning, we look at which is the highest priority to tackle and reform the swarm across team and reporting lines, taking the entire pillar's capacity into account. The idea, originally brought up to meet the needs of resource constraints against all we had to do, is now being used across nearly all of the product engineering teams in the enterprise pillar. A culture that was built in times of growth needs to change. And in this way, I was lucky, as I had some idea of what it needed to change into. I didn't balk at how much smaller the organization kept shrinking, coming from an engineering team of no more than 20 at its largest. When timelines would move up, I remembered working against the hard deadlines that are written into the US Constitution. When there were rapidly changing priorities as expectations right-sized alongside with the organization, I thought about my time in an industry that could not be more highly mission-driven. I knew, as long as we understood a high-level vision that we could all contribute to, that every pivot is best framed and understood as another opportunity to learn and to collaborate. I now challenge you all here today. What does it look like to recognize and come to terms with the fact that the size of your team is just the size of your team? What would it look like if your team, your organization, had more diffuse ownership, less claimed territory? What goals would be unlocked once your teams come up with a shared understanding of what could be accomplished collectively versus within the rigid confines of your existing or previous teams? It's important to get teams thinking in this way and used to working in this way, as ultimately the magic trick to growing without headcount and accomplishing without additional people is unlocking and unblocking the folks who are already a part of your organization. Even if it's just as a thought experiment, start thinking about what it would look like to take your organizational structures down to their component parts, which, by the way, are its people, and building them back up in new and interesting ways to meet current mutual needs. If your team of 8 became a team of 4, you and your colleagues, who are likely in the same boat, can take Kydland's Law into your own hands and propose what it would look like to combine forces, to work flexibly, and restructure as needed to tackle that big problem again, even if it's just temporary. It's recognizing that we are all very likely in, or will be in, leaner, smaller organizations with bigger, loftier goals, and appreciating the unique opportunities that this creates to learn and to grow. Never fear. I want to let you all in on something. There's a common way that we ended calls in 2020 that I think is just absolutely evergreen and that I'll return to probably for the rest of my career. We can do hard things. Though to that I would add that we can do hard things if we do them together. Thank you.